Good afternoon. My name is Marc Davenport, and welcome to Straight to the Top, a program committed to bringing you quality information for your personal and career development. We have an exciting topic today, which is African Americans, a global perspective. We have a very special guest who's going to help us shed some light on this important debate. I'd like to introduce Mr. Julius Johnson. Julius, welcome to Straight to the Top. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Mark. It's my pleasure.
Julius, for the benefit of the audience, why don't you just give us a little bit of background history on who you are and what you've done and also what you're doing today.
I was born in Far Rockaway, Queens, New York, and graduated from Beach Channel High School, where I was a star basketball player and had aspirations to go into the NBA or to play overseas. While attending Beach Channel High School, I was recruited by scouts from St. Lawrence University, a small liberal arts institution on the Canadian border. They invited me up to St. Lawrence and asked me to play at their university. Once I got there, however, I met Dr. Ahmed Samatar, who subsequently became my mentor, and he, by the way, is one of the prominent scholars today from the country of Somalia. And he said to me, Julius, if you ever want to be something in life, you need to put the basketball down and you need to develop your mind. I took his advice. I stopped playing varsity basketball my freshman year and pursued my education. While at St. Lawrence, I applied for and received the Sol Feinstone International Study Award, which allowed me to travel to Nairobi, Kenya, and spend time with the Samburu people, a nomadic people in the north of the country, and returned to St. Lawrence, where I graduated, and then went on to pursue my graduate studies at Yale University, completing them in 1992. After graduate school at Yale, I went on to Washington, D.C., where I worked in political party training, civic organization capacity building, civic education, and election monitoring throughout the world, but primarily focused on the continent of Africa.
Julius, you said you received your graduate degree from Yale. What was your graduate degree in?
My graduate degree from Yale was in African Studies with an emphasis on political economy.
So your mentor was from Eastern Africa. You traveled to Africa while an undergraduate student. Upon graduating from Yale, you went to Washington, D.C., and got involved in a process with the emphasis on political and economic development in Africa. What was it about Africa that had attracted you so much? Because after all, you started out in Queens.
For sure. While at St. Lawrence University, I had the opportunity to meet international students from around the world. It was the African students, however, that had a profound impact on me. They were focused, determined, and very globally minded, and I befriended them. They invited me to their country. I had an opportunity to study their language, particularly in Nairobi, Kenya. And of course, being an African American, I knew historically that black people in the United States emanated from the continent of Africa, and it was a continent that I knew very little about. So I decided to go there, master the language, experience the culture, and get a grounding in African history, which in fact is the history of all mankind.
Question. A buzzword we hear a lot of these days, the word global economy, global market, etc., and so forth. What does the word globalization mean to someone like you who's traveled?
Globalization is the coming together of nation states. At the core of the concept is the oneness of mankind. Essentially, it's and in practical terms, it's opening up one's markets, it's participating in dialogue across cultures and nation states, it's sharing of technology, and understanding that all of mankind shares all 196,940,000 square miles on the planet Earth.
There are two schools of thought in the area of globalization. Number one, it's a bad thing. Number two, it's a good thing. What's your take?
My take is it's a good thing. There's one Earth, and we're really one people. And historically speaking, a lot of the borders currently bordering nation states, some of them were arbitrarily placed there. For example, during the colonial period in Africa, you have the same people, say for example in Ghana and Togo. However, because the English colonized Ghana and the French colonized Togo, the Ghanaians speak English, the Togolese speak French, but they are both, for example, Ga people, which is the ethnic group that populate that particular part of the world. And so borders traditionally have divided. And with globalization, there's a transcendence of borders and an integration of markets and a sharing of information, a sharing of knowledge, and this leads to prosperity and betterment for both countries.
Because our focus today is on globalization, decided to leave the Western clothes in the closet and wear something suitable for our adventure today. Tell us about some of the places we're going to visit today, Julius.
Well, some of the places that I've worked and lived in are Tokyo, Japan, Lilongwe, Malawi, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, Lomé, Togo, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I've also spent time in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and a little time in Kinshasa, Zaire, now known as the Congo.
Question for you. Because again, we want to get right to the heart of the matter. How are African Americans portrayed and perceived in a country like or city like Tokyo, Japan, which I believe is a large metropolitan type city?
Well, living in Tokyo was phenomenal. It was absolutely extraordinary. Prior to going, I had stereotypes really of the Japanese people. Many of the students at Yale University were Japanese, and I always had a tremendous amount of respect for them. I discovered after living in Japan, and I actually lived in Tochigi-ken, which is a prefecture, an area north of Tokyo, in a city called Utsunomiya-shi. And there were about 4 stereotypes, really, that the Japanese people had of African Americans, and they weren't necessarily negative. One of them was our role in the military. Because of our bases in Okinawa, they were familiar with African American soldiers. The other stereotype was, of course, our athleticism. They were accustomed to us playing basketball and being great sportsmen. The third stereotype I found was the black person as the entertainer. They had a high regard for the Michael Jacksons, the Boyz II Men, Mariah Carey, Janet Jackson, and other superstars that have international fame. And the last stereotype, and this was the negative one, was of course some of the negative behavior that is portrayed through the media about African Americans, unfortunately. So those were the 4 stereotypes that I encountered while living in Japan of African Americans.
Julius, overall, how would you say that African Americans are portrayed in the media in places like Japan?
I'd say very stereotypically. You don't find African Americans doing ordinary, everyday things in Japan. So you find us in very stereotypical roles, and primarily because we don't control our own images abroad. And this, of course, is problematic. And because there is not a large African American presence in Tokyo, these images are not challenged. You don't find, for example, the African American man with his wife taking a stroll in the park, or studying for an examination, or going to the gym to work out, or just pondering issues that may perplex him or her.
How do you say good morning in Japanese?
Utsunomiya shi.
Okay. Let's jump back on the plane. Let's have our passport stamped. What country are we going to next?
Hey, let's go to Nairobi, Kenya, and talk about the city in the sun.
How are blacks portrayed in the media in a place like Nairobi, Kenya?
Well, Nairobi, Kenya has very limited, unfortunately, technological tools that would allow it to bring into its country the images of African Americans. So, for example, a lot of our images come through CNN, the BBC, and other international TV stations. Locally, in the local channels, again, because there isn't a large African American presence in Kenya, they really aren't exposed to the everyday African American person. They, however, get the sitcoms. And so, again, you find the stereotypes being portrayed there also. They get the George Jeffersons of the world, the J.J. Walkers of the world, the comic view, if you will, and not the serious-minded, analytical mind of the African American intellect, or what we're like in our everyday surroundings.
How do they view us here, the African Americans in this country? Do they respect us? Do they look up to us? Do they admire us? What are their attitudes towards us?
My experience is Kenyans had a very favorable attitude toward African Americans, and this is something that I found throughout my travels around the world. Black people abroad are embraced. We, of course, have not colonized any nations, and we have been viewed as the underdogs abroad. The individuals from this country of color are seen as people who have endured tremendous hardship, people who have endured struggle, people who have come together to transcend racism and sexism and other diseases that plague the mind. And so we are respected and honored, and I found a tremendous amount of camaraderie from our brothers and our sisters throughout the world, particularly on the African continent.
Julius, for the entrepreneurs watching this show today, is Nairobi, Kenya a place suitable for commerce?
For sure. All of Africa is suitable for commerce. Kenyans, like most Africans, are very open-minded. They're aggressive. They're willing to do business abroad. Recently, there was a favorable trade bill passed by the Bush administration that allows African manufactured goods to be exported to the United States without tariff or duty. And this is to stir up the African economy. It's to stimulate the economy and to bring American investors into Africa to look at the natural resources, to build infrastructure like railroads, telephone lines, technological institutions that can contribute to the free flow of goods and services, not only on the continent, between African nations, but also abroad to the United States and to Europe.
Before we depart from Nairobi, Kenya, because the pilot is telling us to board the plane, how do you say good morning in Nairobi, in Kenya?
Habari yako asubuhi. That's
it.
good morning.
That's quite a mouthful. Back on the plane, our passport is stamped. Let's head to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Tell us about that experience.
Now, Saudi Arabia was a phenomenal experience. You know, I say that the Japanese taught me about space because there isn't a lot of space in Japan. And being an American, I was accustomed to big houses and big cars, and being 6'3", 228 pounds, I was used to a little elbow room. But in Japan, I had to adjust to limited space and also to the concept of privacy because I had to deal with being in crowded situations in Japan,
okay.
but at the same time needing privacy. So I learned how to adjust my own expectations in Japan, and I came away with a newfound appreciation for limited space. And so the Japanese taught me about space. The Africans, I say, I gained knowledge about time because unlike in the United States where everything is scheduled and there's this linear concept of time, in the African context, time is more cyclical. And there's a Nubian proverb that says, I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. It's this reciprocity of being, this cyclical relationship that in the end, everything comes full circle. And there isn't this linear sense of living. And that was quite an adjustment for a Westerner to embrace, to adapt to, and to respect. And then, of course, the Arabs. The Arabs taught me about faith, to believe in God, something that I couldn't see, touch, or taste. You'll notice that the Arab, whenever he says he's about to do something, he will always say, Insha'Allah, meaning if Allah wills, it will be done. And so I thank the Japanese for giving me knowledge about space, the Africans for giving me knowledge about time, and of course my Arab brothers for giving me knowledge about faith.
Where did you live, or what cities did you live in or travel to when you were in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia?
Well, I actually lived in Taif, which is a mountainous area 40 minutes from the holy city of Mecca. I also spent considerable time in Jeddah, a huge commercial city, as well as the two holy cities, Mecca and Medina.
How are blacks in this country portrayed over there? Negatively or in a positive light?
Again, because we don't control our own images, we are not necessarily portrayed in a positive manner. Saudi Arabia is very conservative, and you don't find on the local Saudi channels sitcoms on African American pop culture or American culture in general. A lot of the television shows are on issues related to Islamic history, culture, and shows from the Middle East. And so, to answer your question, the image of African Americans is neutral, I would say, in Saudi Arabia.
What do they think of us here? What sort of response or feedback as a black African American living in that part of the world? Were they holding on to stereotypes when they looked at you, when they saw you? What's their perception of life here in the States for us?
Well, I think initially when an Arab meets a person of darker complexion, he or she first wants to identify where the person's from. You know, is this person a Nigerian? Is this person from the Caribbean? Or is this person an American? And once you're identified as an American, I think then your national position in the world supersedes your ethnic background. And so I was treated very much as an American, not necessarily as an African American.
If you saw a friend of yours in Taif or in Mecca, how would you greet him?
I would greet him with the Arabic words of peace. Salamu alaikum, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, ya Muslim. Kef halik, habibi.
And what does that mean?
That simply means peace be upon you, How are you, my dear brother?
Let's jump back on the plane. Where we headed?
How about if we take a trip to Ghana?
Ghana, from what I understand, one of the more affluent African states.
Yes, Ghana is a phenomenal country, rich in history, language, and tremendous beauty. I was there actually in 1992 where I led an international survey mission looking at the political climate preparing for the upcoming elections. And while I was there, we interviewed and met with all the major political parties, and we surveyed the uh, political landscape to ensure that during the electoral process, the process would be transparent, it would be open, and people would be able to participate democratically. Ghana, of course, is known for the kente cloth, which is a world famous fabric of fine silk, beautiful design.
What,
And
what is the predominant religion in Ghana?
the predominant religion in Ghana is, I think there's about maybe 50% Christian, maybe 35, 40% Muslim, and other local religions. The other interesting thing about Ghana, for those who may not know, is that Ghana was the first African nation to receive independence in 1957 by the late, great Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who, by the way, received his education from Lincoln University, a historically black institution in Pennsylvania. So there's a tremendous amount of pride in Ghana and prosperity, and I look forward to going back and meeting with my Ghanaian brothers and sisters and enjoying the wonderful food, particularly the fufu, which the Ghanaians serve so deliciously.
Is that made with peanut butter?
No, that's the peanut butter soup you're referring to. The peanut butter is made with the peanut butter soup, but the dish I'm talking about is a local dish, and it's called fufu, and it's served with yam and beef, chicken, and it's very flavorful.
How do you say good morning in Ghana?
Well, I will say Nangadef. Nangadef. That is Wolof, and that means how are you?
Now let's jump back on the plane because we're almost out of time and we're heading back to the United States. Is it important, in your opinion, Julius, for African Americans in this country to take note at what's happening with other peoples of color around the world?
I think it's absolutely critical. It is absolutely critical for African Americans to take note of what's happening globally. We are at a time in the 21st century where countries are coming together. There's more travel now between nations than ever before. We are in an economic position to afford a lot of the travel, to engage in business, to engage in commerce. I think it's very, very important with the European Union coming together and the Asian states coming together. It's important that black people around the world realize they have commonalities, they have a common history, and hopefully a common destiny. So it's absolutely essential that we educate ourselves, we transcend those ethnic boundaries that will keep us locked in our own small boxes, and we venture out and explore the world and see what the world has to offer us, because there's tremendous opportunity out there.
Julius, we're almost out of time. What are you doing now, okay, professionally? And then finally, I'd like for you to close by leaving the audience with an important message.
Well, right now, I'm based in Washington, D.C., where I'm an independent international consultant working with nation states, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, who are interested in doing business with America and also serving as an intermediary for African American and American Fortune 500 companies that are interested in doing business abroad.
What is your phone number?
My phone number is 202-387-0060.
What is your email address?
IBNABUAOL.com.
Listen, thanks for watching the show. Julius will have the last word, just a few seconds. What's the message you want to leave with the audience?
Don't stay in the box. Remember the 3 C's: capital, credentials, and contacts. Get them. They give you access to make things happen.
Stay focused, and you too will go straight to the top. God bless. Hello, my name is Marc Davenport, and